Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining the Western EIM Governance Review Committee meeting. Please note that all audience member lines are in a listen-only mode until we reach the Q&A portions of these slides. However, you can raise your hand at any time to ask a question by dialing #2 into your telephone keypad. Please note we will not be accepting chat questions at this time. If, however, you require technical assistance, please send a private note to me, the event producer, via the chat panel in the lower right-hand corner. With that, I'll turn the call over to Deputy General Counsel Burton Gross. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Burt Gross at the Cal ISO, and I'm sitting in for Roger Cullenton today in the corporate secretary function just to commence this meeting. So, Therese, with your permission, maybe I should go ahead and call roll, and then we can turn over to the business of the meeting. Does that sound good?
Yes, thanks, Bert.
Sure. Okay, let me just go through that. Tony Braun?
Here.
Andrew Campbell?
Here.
Suzanne Cooper?
Here.
Eric Eisenman?
Here.
Jennifer Gardner?
Here.
Therese Hampton?
Here.
Doug Howe?
Here.
Rob Taylor?
Here.
Rebecca Wagner?
Here.
Mary Winke?
Here.
Cameron Yurkowski?
I'm here.
Commissioner Raper?
Yes, here.
Angelina Galitova?
Present.
And Valerie Fong.
Here.
Okay, that's everybody. So we have obviously more than a quorum. Therese, we can move forward. I don't know if you want to do an introduction next or if you want to do the minutes, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, if we go to the next slide, it just gives us the agenda for the day. We will take public comment. Just for those of you on the phone, we'll take public comment on those items that are not on the agenda. If you have a public comment on anything related to our activities, and then we will make the decision on our September 15th general session minutes, and then we'll kind of move into the body of what we intend to talk about today. Why don't we go ahead and do the minutes first, and then we'll step forward for public comment.
Okay, that sounds great. So, yeah, we have the September 15th, 2020 general session minutes, which have been circulated to the committee for review, and I guess I would be looking for a motion to approve those minutes from one of the voting members of the committee, please.
This is Rob Taylor. I'll move.
Okay.
Tony Braun, I'll second.
Tony Braun.
This is Tony Braun, I'll second.
Okay, that's great. I think we do need to kind of go through the formalities here and actually take a roll call vote on the minutes too, just because otherwise it'll be hard to make sure we have a clear record. So I'll go through that really quickly again. I apologize for the inconvenience, but Tony Braun?
Yes.
Andrew Campbell?
Yes.
Suzanne Cooper?
Yes.
Eric Eisenman?
Yes.
Jennifer Gardner?
Yes.
Therese Hampton?
Yes.
Doug Howe?
Yes.
Rob Taylor?
Yes.
Rebecca Wagner?
Yes.
Mary Winke?
Yes.
Cameron Yurkowski?
Yes.
And then Commissioner Raper?
Aye.
Yes, and that's all of the voting members, so I think that concludes it. We have a unanimous approval of the minutes, and I'll turn it back to you, Therese.
Terrific. Thank you, Bert. Operator, if you can let the participants know how they might indicate if they have any public comment to give on items relative to the Governance Review Committee that are not part of our agenda today.
If you would like to give a comment, please dial #2 with your telephone keypad. We have no comments at this time.
Okay, great. We will be taking comment on the issues that we're talking about today, so you'll have other opportunities. So welcome. Thank you for joining us for this Governance Review Committee meeting. I'm actually feel honored and grateful to have all the Governance Review Committee members with us here today, and you're going to hear from a number of them, so that's nice. We're going to go through a process update. We're going to provide an overview of the issues that are under discussion within the Governance Review Committee as we're moving towards a revised straw proposal, and we're going to talk a little bit about the schedule for the release of the straw proposal. And so if you go to the next slide, we'll start there with the schedule, just a little bit of history in terms of where we've been and then where we think we're headed. So we issued a scoping paper back at the end of January of 2020. We took comments through the month of February. We had a public meeting in early March to kind of hear from stakeholders on their comments on the scoping paper, which then we spent several months as a Governance Review Committee. We broke into subcommittees to really understand stakeholder comments and use those to form the initial straw proposal, which was released the end of July. We took comments through August. We had a workshop in September. You can see a pattern here. And since that point in time now, we have, again, broken into subgroups to really understand and kind of dig deep into the stakeholder comments, look at options, and explore different ways of addressing the stakeholder comments in the development of the revised straw proposal. We do have a goal of getting a revised straw proposal out before the end of fourth quarter 2020. We'll talk about that really at the end of the conversation, where we think that schedule looks like. And still targeting a draft final proposal by Q1 of 2021. There will be opportunity for public comment on the revised straw proposal. There will also be opportunity for public comment on the draft final proposal as well. At the last meeting we had, I think it was in September, there was a request for a little bit more conversation with stakeholders about the things that the GRC is deliberating on or considering when developing a proposal. So that's really the approach that we intend to take to today's meeting. If we go to the next slide, what we wanted to do is kind of have a conversation with you about what we've done since the comments that we received, since the workshop in September, and kind of give you a sense of the issues that are under conversation. So we've divided into 3 working groups. You're going to hear from members of each of the working groups. And what we'd like to do is kind of share a list of the issues that we're working on, and they'll give you a little bit more of the detail of the conversation around it, what we heard from stakeholders, what are some of the decision factors. But just a reminder, there are no conclusions yet on any individual issue. In fact, where we are in the process is the work groups are meeting and they're kind of working through the issues, but the issues haven't been to the full GRC for deliberation. And so in some ways we thought this was the perfect time to have conversation with stakeholders and kind of share where we're at, but we have to be mindful. You may have questions, which are great. They may not be able to answer them. We're not going to necessarily be able to give you any indications or direction because the full GRC has not deliberated. And ultimately, similar to what we did with the straw proposal, we look at this as an entire package. So with that kind of as a context, we're going to transition to the first working group, which is the Delegation of Authority working group. There are a couple of members from that working group that are going to talk about a couple of issues, give you some context, and then we will take questions at the end after the members of the work group have all spoken. If you do have a question as you're going through, you know you're going to have a question, go ahead and hit, is it #2? Did I get that right? Hit the indicator that you will have a question, and we'll get to you at the end of the presentation. Operator, is it #2? Did I get that right?
That is correct. It is #2.
Okay, great. So we're going to start, if you switch slides to the next slide, we're going to start with the Delegation of Authority working group, and we're going to start with Tony Braun.
Thanks, Therese. Is this coming through clearly?
Yes.
Thank you. So as Therese mentioned, we divided up into working groups, and I am part of what we call the Delegated Authority Working Group, for lack of a better term. And we are tasked with looking at the comments of stakeholders and making recommendations related to whether the joint authority model is appropriate for EIM and maybe EIMEDAM, and then also a lot of second, third, fourth, and fifth level down details in how it might be implemented. I think it's fair to note that the joint authority model did receive a lot of support in the stakeholder comments. However, there were commenters that had some concerns. In particular, Southern California Edison and the California Public Advocate's Office raised some concerns that we want to consider and address. Those concerns centered, if I could paraphrase a bit, around a couple of items. One, the fundamental obligations of the Board of Governors to govern the corporation, and then also a concern which arises in other forums on other non-governance issues as well, and that is the distinction between participation in the market if you're within the California Balancing Authority area, which is for all intents and purposes compulsory, and the model of the EIM and the EIMEDAM as has been articulated to date, which is a voluntary market with shorter withdrawal periods and also some voluntary market design elements associated with it. And so the working group is examining these arguments and others related to it. It may seem kind of simple. Joint authority, is it joint, is it not? But how joint authority gets applied is really important to whether it's a good idea or not. And as such, it's anything but simple. And we'll get into some of those issues here in a moment. Before I turn the mic over to the next working group member, there were a couple other issues that were raised in this context. One was what we interpreted to be a concern about the logistical costs of administering the joint model, since there would be potential for larger meetings and more varied meeting locations. So we're working with the ISO to understand the level of those costs in the governance model that we're using today and how they might compare, and also how those costs and fees are collected in the marketplace. And then finally, Pacific Gas and Electric raised a concern about scenarios in the future where a joint authority or any other model that we pick, I think, might not be appropriate if the market, for example, there are so many departures from the market that you're really fundamentally questioning the overall efficacy of it. And so these triggering events might lead to a different conclusion on governance. And so we're examining whether that is an appropriate mechanism to put in, and if so, how it would work. So hopefully this provides a little insight into some of the issues that we're working on. And right now I'd like to turn it over to Doug Howe to talk a little bit about the scope of the potential joint authority model and some of the down deeper issues that might arise if we were to move in that direction.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Am I coming through? Okay, very good. So the specific issue that Tony asked me to address deals with the scope of joint authority, and exactly does that mean all of the real-time market, and does it mean all of the EIM? And in the case of EIMEDAM and the day-ahead market, are those two things coextensive? And to better understand that, we asked the CAISO staff to help us parse through the CAISO tariff into those sections that would be joint authority versus those that would solely be under Board of Governors authority. That exercise illustrated to us that while the real-time market and EIM are indeed tightly integrated, there are some aspects of these markets which are unique to each. Rules which apply only in the EIM outside of the CAISO or outside of California, and conversely, those which apply only inside CAISO or inside of California. Excuse me. Some examples would include things like the GHG adder, which is applicable only to EIM entities outside of California. And some market power mitigation rules might be applicable only inside of the CAISO or inside of California. The current system market power mitigation proposed rule, which will be before the Board of Governors, I think in December, is an example of a rule which will affect the real-time market, but at least in its current form and at this time, is going to be uniquely applied to the CAISO balancing area authority. So there are other examples about this when we expand into a possible EIDAM. Now, we don't know what EIDAM is going to look like. The rules for EIDAM, the structure of EIDAM have not been laid out. So trying to determine exactly what joint authority means in the case of EIDAM and the day-ahead market is really a very speculative exercise, and so we haven't gone there. But we are working on better articulating the scope of joint authority in the case of the real-time market and the EIM, so that those rules which are truly unique to the ISO or to California and which do not materially affect the rest of the EIM can somehow be isolated out of the joint authority. We're not yet ready to discuss exactly what that looks like, as Teresa said. We have not discussed this with the full GRC yet, but we expect that the next revised straw proposal will propose to address these issues. So that should be coming in the next revised proposal. With that, I believe, Teresa, I am to pass it over to Jennifer for the next issue.
Great. Thank you, Doug. So I am also a member of the Delegation of Authority Working Group, and I was tasked with addressing the following two issues. The first one is resolving deadlocks under the joint authority model, and the second is the process for addressing short-term emergency filings. So first, with regard to resolving deadlocks, just as a refresher, under the joint authority model, where both boards' approval will be required to move forward with a Section 205 filing or FERC, I think it's obvious that circumstances could arise where both boards are unable to agree to approve a proposed tariff change, and so therefore we end up in a deadlock. So in those circumstances, in our straw proposal, we set forth a process and we wanted stakeholder feedback. And in that process, we lay out an iterative process for addressing these types of deadlocks. So at a high level, we're providing flexibility with both boards. We're letting them send the issue back through a stakeholder process in an attempt to resolve any disputes or any concerns. And then at some point in that process, the boards could ultimately decide, you know what, we can't reach agreement, this tariff change is needed, so we are going to direct CAISO management to move forward with what we're calling dual, or sometimes referred to as jump ball, Section 205 filings or FERC. All this means is that the EIM Governing Body would have a tariff change that it supported, and the CAISO Board of Governors would have a slightly different tariff change that it supported. CAISO management would make their Section 205 filing at FERC. That would include both options within that filing. It would then be up to FERC to decide which of those two options is sort of the most just and reasonable option. Now, the majority of stakeholders generally supported this process for resolving deadlocks. I think that most stakeholders agree that dual filings are not ideal. We would prefer to have both boards in agreement on a tariff change, and then and only then would we move forward with that tariff change at FERC. However, stakeholders were also understanding that there could be circumstances where we simply can't get to that point, and that tariff change is important enough that we need to move forward without having consensus among both boards. So there seems to be general support for dual filings, but stakeholders flagged some concerns regarding the uncertainty created by these filings and how FERC would actually handle these types of filings. And so really quickly, I want to make clear that after some conversations with CAISO Legal and internal discussions with the working group, we are in a position now where we can say that where FERC has these Section 205 filings, these dual filings in front of them, it is our understanding based on current precedent that FERC would not have the ability to sort of pick and choose different elements of each filing, but rather would have to either accept or deny each filing. So we're not going to end up in a situation where FERC could come up with an entirely new rate design as a result of dual filings. FERC would have to either pick the EIM Governing Body's preferred tariff change or the CAISO Board of Governors' preferred tariff change. So that should resolve some of the uncertainty that was flagged in the stakeholder comments. But we will be addressing this in more detail in the next version of the straw proposal. So I think the other issue that came up under resolving deadlocks that I want to quickly address is the GRC had asked stakeholders whether a different process should be established, and so this would be a process different from the approach to dual filings, where the following circumstances arise. So this would be a situation where one board approves a tariff change and the other board does not, and further, does not have an alternative that it would support. So that board would prefer to remain with the status quo. So we received a few recommendations for how that unique set of circumstances might be handled, but after some additional discussions within the working group and again with CAISO Legal, we were able to conclude that a separate process really wouldn't be necessary for these types of circumstances. In fact, the dual Section 205 filings would still work. And in those circumstances, the board that prefers to remain with the status quo would basically be the nature of their competing filing under the dual filing approach. And so thankfully we were able to resolve that issue, and I think that will streamline the process for resolving deadlocks, which again we will provide a lot more detail on in the next version of the straw proposal. Really quickly, with the little bit of time that I have left, the second issue I addressed that I was charged with addressing in the work group was the process for addressing short-term emergency filings. So as a reminder, short-term emergency filings will be exceedingly rare if they happen at all, and they would only be implicated where circumstances make it difficult to convene both boards and the tariff change at issue is urgently needed to prevent market manipulation or to preserve grid reliability. It's also worth noting that these filings are temporary in nature and they will only be in effect for 90 days. So in the straw proposal, the GRC set forth 3 options for approving these types of filings before they go to FERC. The first option was that CAISO management would obtain approval from either board, depending on which board could be more readily convened. The second option was that the designated approval body would alternate back and forth between both boards over time. And the third option was that CAISO management could make these filings without obtaining board approval. So overwhelmingly, the vast majority of stakeholders supported either of the first 2 options, and there was general discomfort with these types of filings moving forward without some type of board approval. Additionally, one stakeholder suggested a 4th option, and that was that CAISO management would obtain approval from only the chairs of both boards before moving forward with this type of filing. So there's really 4 options on the table, and we're still considering all of these options, and we'll obviously have more details in the next version of the straw proposal. But I think it's important to note, and after discussions in the working group, we really came to realize that these types of filings, although exceedingly rare, will be very important and very urgently needed in these types of circumstances. And so really what we're having to do in terms of developing a process is balance 2 competing but really important needs. And one of those needs is flexibility. We need CAISO management to be able to move forward quickly with these types of filings when they're needed. But the other important interest that we have to balance is that the boards have to be aware of what's going on and what the circumstances are that are leading to these filings, and ideally should be able to provide some type of approval before CAISO management moves forward. And so again, we are still fine-tuning the process that we'd like to propose for addressing these filings, but those are the considerations that we are currently taking into account as we fine-tune the proposed process. So with that, I will turn it over to Suzanne Cooper, who will be addressing the next issue. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. The issue that I'm going to describe a bit here is dispute resolution, the process for changes or addressing disputes around changes to governance issues. So this issue really goes to the durability of the delegation of authority from the CAISO board to the EIM governing body. But the straw proposal, we proposed a unanimous vote of the CAISO board for any changes that would impact the scope or type of delegated authority to the governing body. And we also included that there would be a stakeholder process ahead of that would evaluate and provide feedback on such a proposal, and that there be advisory input from the governing body and the RIF and the BOSSer if they chose to provide some feedback as well, and that also before any changes that were adopted could be implemented, there would need to be a mandatory notice period that would be equal to the length of the notice period that entities would have for withdrawing from the market. We received some some stakeholder feedback that recommended that and saw a need perhaps for additional protection for the durability of the delegated authority. And Chelan and PGP had proposed that the dispute resolution process that Jennifer just described be utilized for any disagreements between the governing body. So if the governing body gave an advisory opinion that did not support a proposed change, yet the board did support the proposed change, that we use the same process as Jennifer described, where there be a couple of attempts to reach agreement between the board and the governing body, and have some stakeholder input during those attempts, but that after 2 attempts, if the governing body still didn't support the proposed change, that the board would be able to move forward with the change, subject, of course, to a unanimous vote for it and the notice requirements I mentioned. But there's also this idea put forth that after that also any changes wouldn't go into effect absent receiving an affirmative declaration from FERC that the governance change would meet FERC's independent standards. And there was also a commenter, WAPA had proposed that any changes to the governance for the market be approved by a vote of at least 75% of both of the bodies, the board and the governing body, and that if there were a tie in that, so one voted for, one voted against, that an alternative be put in place where a random selection of the largest potential kind of odd number subset of the 2 bodies would convene and make a decision via a supermajority vote. So the GRC, in our subgroup, our working group, we've been considering these alternatives, and I'd say that a couple of things that we're evaluating and trying to weigh are how each would align with or fit with the ISO board's corporate responsibilities, and then with the proposal around having some independent review from FERC, understanding what the nature of independence, FERC would apply, and what might come out of that kind of review, and whether it would even fit be a fit to ask for that kind of review. So those are the types of issues that we're working through, and the full board will be deliberating on this relatively soon. And I think I am passing it to Therese.
To me, yes. Thanks, Suzanne.
Yes.
Thanks for that. So this is a point where there were several different issues that each of the work group members highlighted. And so if you have a question or a comment or something you'd like to provide to the Governance Review Committee on any of those topics, if you would press #2 and let us know.
I actually had one hand raised from far earlier. Caller.
Great.
Number is ending in 6536. Your line has been unmuted. Please make sure to unmute from your end as well. They might have stepped away. Caller, your hand is being lowered. Please raise your hand again if you would like to ask a question.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes.
Hi.
Yes, this is Elaine Ginocchio with WEAB. I just had one question. It had to do with defining the dispute resolution process. Thank you. That was a really great answer to clarify what happens at FERC when you have dueling proposals. I was just wondering, in the next proposal or in the next open meeting, if you're going to discuss some of the issues that came up about the actual practicalities of, CAISO representing two different boards with two different proposals.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. It's a really great point. And yes, a number of stakeholders did flag that issue. And really this comes down to a couple of different things, right? It's an issue of logistics. We have a team of attorneys working at CAISO that would obviously be responsible for representing the positions of two different boards, but also I think there's additional underlying concern, is there the potential for CAISO legal to be conflicted in being able to represent both boards. And so I think the best way to answer that is today we have CAISO legal working with both boards, and we haven't really faced any of these issues. Now, under a joint authority model, things look a little bit different. And so we're still working through that, but absolutely that is one of the issues that we plan to address in the next iteration of the proposal. But at this point, it's not something that's going to prevent us from moving forward with the concept of a dual filing. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Right, and we have one more call.
Great. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. Thank you for that. My name is Joseph Aboliman. I'm calling from the Public Advocate Office at the California Public Utilities Commission. Thank you for that explanation. But my question is, did you discuss a method or an approach to resolve any differences between two proposals within the state? You may have already said it, maybe it wasn't clear to me, before those two proposals even get to FERC. So was there any conversation in terms of a method or an approach to resolve the differences that might exist within the two proposals before you even get to FERC? Because I think, yes, I heard you say that we do not want the FERC to come up with a third proposal if those two proposals were to be reviewed by FERC. You want to avoid the FERC, having to come up with a third proposal. That the preference is for the FERC to choose one of those two proposals. But my question then is, perhaps we can come up with an approach or a method to resolve whatever differences may exist within those two proposals before it even gets to the FERC at all. I just want to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's definitely an important issue. And so I think the issue that you are highlighting here is the fact that, yes, there is general agreement among stakeholders that a dual filing, while certainly a good tool to have under the joint authority model, is perhaps not ideal. And I think the ideal scenario is where both boards agree that a tariff change is not only needed, but that the way that CAISO management is proposing that tariff change is the appropriate way for addressing the issue. And we have both boards approving that tariff change. We have one proposal going to FERC, and FERC can either accept that or deny that. And so regarding the issue that you're highlighting where the boards do not agree, but perhaps there's the opportunity to reach agreement before going to FERC, despite that initial disagreement, I think what I said earlier, and perhaps I didn't emphasize it enough, is that as we proposed in our straw proposal, there is this sort of iterative process that we're envisioning that would happen within the stakeholder process that we have today. So let's say an issue gets in front of both boards, they can't agree. The boards could then agree at that point that they need to send the tariff issue back through the CAISO stakeholder process to address any discrepancies or any issues highlighted by either board. And although we haven't finalized this process yet, and you'll see the final process in the next version of the straw proposal, the idea here is that you could go through this stakeholder process perhaps 1, 2, even 3 times, and perhaps by doing that, you could reach agreement before going to FERC, and then you would no longer need a dual filing. But that was the idea when we proposed that iterative process originally. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. I think that's what I was actually wanting to hear, since, the two bodies represent, the ratepayers within California and other balancing authority areas. I think it makes a whole lot of sense for you to come back to the stakeholders and let them be the final arbiter of what they want, how they want the tariffs to be. Thank you for that explanation. It was very helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
And with that, there are no further questions.
Thank you. Nikki, are you able to go to the next slide? Yes, great. Okay, so we're going to move to the next working group, which is we've labeled the Stakeholder Engagement Working Group. You can see the issues that they have addressed, and we're going to turn to Rebecca Wagner to talk about some of the regional issue forum items that are listed here.
Thanks, Therese. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to cover 2 components of changes to the RIF. The first of which is how do we memorialize the changes that we have are considered under the straw proposal, and the second is do we need to modify the sector definitions. Starting with memorializing changes to the RIF, we received comments that generally supported that the RIF should have the limitation removed that it cannot consider matters that are part of an existing ISO stakeholder process. So that, I think that was uniformly supported. Another suggestion from commenters was that the RIF should have the ability to provide opinions and or recommendations to the EIM Governing Body and the board. And while there's not a preclusion from that right now, I think the intent was to have some more guardrails around that and some more specific direction. And finally, one other comment of note is just the reminder that the RIF should not evolve into a super stakeholder entity. That has been a concern since the formation of the RIF under the transitional committee. So with those items in mind, our sub-working group has been discussing, how can the changes to the RIF be memorialized? Generally thinking modifications to the EIM governance charter, and from a practical standpoint, how will those changes work as they're applied in practice? Turning to the sector definitions, we had commenters suggest that it's time to update those definitions as the EIM has evolved significantly since we first created the original governance documents. And there was also a suggestion to align the sectors with the nominating committee sectors. So on this topic, we're looking at the sectors that may need a little bit of a makeover. For example, the neighboring balancing authority area sector may not necessarily be needed or relevant given the number of entities who have already joined the EIM. So how do we make that over or transition that to something different? And we're also exploring how the evolution of EIMEDAM might affect the sector. So what does that look like down the road? Do we try to anticipate that, or do we hold off until we know more of what that looks like? And obviously things have changed over time in a positive way, but we just are ensuring that these definitions still make sense going forward. So with that, Therese, I will turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm going to just highlight there is the number one item that's on this list, the evaluate diversity of perspective criteria. We did receive specific comment on that to get a little bit more clarity on that. We have taken that into consideration and we'll be addressing that in the revised straw proposal. We don't have much more to elaborate on that. And then I'm going to hand this off to Rob Taylor, who's going to talk about the last item on this list and then an item that's on the next page, and then we'll come back and take public comment. So Rob Taylor, we'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Therese, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to touch on the issue of non-voting liaisons to the body of state regulators. So the issue here, as identified in the proposal, was the issue of the power marketing administrations as well as public power entities seeking an advisory role within the body of state regulators, the BOSR, and to provide perspective on issues that might affect the markets. The BOSR in their comments recognized the value of a public power perspective, but the issue was sort of around the number of liaisons that would participate. So this group has been discussing the process by which liaisons would be selected, the number of those liaisons, as well as how to accommodate for geographic diversity within that number that would be chosen. We're still working through those issues, and they will, of course, be addressed in the final proposal, but wanted to give you an idea as to what we were discussing there. And then if we could move to the next slide, I can address the first issue on the top of that slide. Or actually, not the first issue on the top of that slide. It would be the issue of the third one, discussing funding mechanisms for BOSR support. So the BOSR is seeking funding to help support its members' engagement in both the EIM and the potential day-ahead market. The funding would be to help provide technical expertise and staffing as the BOSR would engage in these forums. A number of commenters suggested that this was appropriate, and no one really disagreed. The issue sort of came around the source of the funding and the mechanism through which the funding would be provided. The straw proposal did recognize that members of the BOSR and the state-regulated market participants were discussing this issue and encouraged those entities to continue to discuss that and work through them and provide a recommendation back to the GRC. So it's our understanding that those discussions have been ongoing. They have been productive. So again, we will address that when we get to the final proposal. And that's all I have. And I think, Therese, did you want to take questions at this point on this one issue and the previous page?
Yes. Nikki, if you can go back to the previous page. Yes. So if there are any questions or comments from the public, pound 2.
It would appear we have no questions or comments at this time.
Okay. If we go to slide 7, then we will transition. This is what we call the other areas of involvement working group, which includes a whole number of things. And Andy Campbell is going to start and talk about a couple of the items on this list. Andy?
All right, thanks, Therese. Yeah, so I'm going to cover items 1 and 2 on this list. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Yeah, so starting with the annual roadmap. So just as a reminder, the annual roadmap is a kind of a process and mechanism the ISO staff uses to prioritize initiatives. The process today is described in the straw proposal. It includes an annual policy initiatives roadmap with an approximate schedule attached to it, as well as a 3-year policy roadmap. And today that process that is developed by ISO staff with stakeholder input. But neither the Board of Governors of the ISO nor the governing body are approving those roadmaps. And it's really left to the discretion of management. So, in prior comments in the straw proposal, we started thinking further about whether we want changes, recommend changes in the process review. And just to kind of bookend the perspectives on the roadmap, there's one bookend is that this is really as a mechanism for ISO staff to prioritize its work and really should be at the discretion of ISO staff and also be easily changed as circumstances change. And then some of the other perspectives, the other bookend are really wanting to make sure there's even some formal mechanisms for the governing body to impact those priorities. And the straw proposal made the recommendation that there would not be governing body approval of the roadmap, but did encourage management to provide more explanation for the relative priorities. Now, we've continued deliberations on this based on stakeholder input. It's still the same kind of bookends that we're working within, but a couple specific ideas have been raised that we're taking a good look at. One is that there could be like an exception process through which the governing body could add a priority to the roadmap. That's one idea. And another idea is that we would recommend that the staff kind of develop more thorough and articulate kind of the decision-making criteria. There'd be sort of stakeholder input on developing those decision criteria. So we're working through that in our deliberations. I should say, many stakeholders were very supportive of the straw proposal on this issue. So we continue to look at that. And the other one, which I'll spend a little bit more time on, is the outside market expert. And here the straw proposal has a recommendation that there would be ability to bring on board an outside market expert. I think similar to what you were hearing about before, through further comments, we've really shed light on additional kind of sub-issues that really need some more attention, as well as actually some big issues that we really need to be a bit clearer on what we're doing, on kind of what the idea of the OME is. So one of the real kind of top-end issues, excuse me, family Zoom life going on around me. So it really, like, what is the OME? What is the scope of the OME? And there are different perspectives on this that kind of really came through clearly through comments. And one is that a view that an OME is really focused on the outside of California ISO market impacts, maybe the impacts on the stakeholders that are outside of the California ISO, that should be the real emphasis, and the thought that maybe that's a gap in the existing set of experts, including the DMM and the MSC. So that's one viewpoint. And then another viewpoint we're also looking at is that an OME should have a scope that aligns with the governing body's scope, which is looking at overall market impacts of and benefits and market-wide. So not just the outside of California ISO. This is a really key issue, just for defining what an OME would be, and it does kind of trickle down to some of the recommendations we might want to make on the issues below that. I think there's continued discussions about the timing of an OME. When should an OME, if there is an OME, when should the OME be brought on? There's different views on when in the EIMEDAM development process that would occur. And there's also important issues about kind of questions about qualifications and scope. And so we're thinking about how to what degree should we, the GRC, really kind of define the specific roles and responsibilities of an OME, and there a number of stakeholders have made some specific recommendations in that regard. But then another approach would be looking to the governing body at the time that the governing body is bringing on an OME and having the governing body define qualifications and duties based on the governing body's needs. So those are two perspectives we're looking at there. And then I guess another question that's kind of come up is sort of how an OME does its work. What kinds of work is it doing? Is it kind of look like a market surveillance committee putting out kind of formal opinions on initiatives, or is it an OME involved in kind of more kind of discrete tasks that may not be at sort of the market initiative level, or it could be a combination of those? And to the extent it is sort of more on the formal opinion route, we want to consider a lot of the open meeting approaches that are used for the MSC to ensure that there's stakeholder input and transparency on that process. So that's some other very important details we're taking a look at. And then the final thing I'll mention relates to cost allocation. And I think you'll probably see in the next document we spent more time looking at how costs are allocated today, how the MSC's costs are allocated today, the DMM's costs are allocated today. And then we'll be looking at those, that particular allocation, whether we still view that as appropriate, as well as looking at an OME, looking at kind of where we're recommending the scope of the OME is, and kind of what the recommendations that, in terms of cost allocation, that fall from that are. So I think that walks through the main issues there. And I will turn it over next to another member of the Other Issues Working Group, Cameron Yurkowski.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and good afternoon to all the attendees. Appreciate your attention to these issues. Can folks hear me okay? Yes, thanks.
Yes.
I'm going to talk about this issue last here on the slides. It says additional review of EIM and EIMEDAM entity implementation tariffs. I think we're really thinking about it at this point a little bit more broadly in terms of the principle of tariff consistency. It is different than the other topics that have been discussed today. So far, it's a relatively new topic that was not called out explicitly in our scoping document or the GRC's draft recommendations to date. And I just highlight that for two reasons. We've obviously had less time to discuss this issue, and so the topic's a little less mature at this point. And so we're looking forward to additional stakeholder comments on this next round, definitely. This topic was highlighted by one commenter in the last round of comments we received, and I think it can be described broadly as a desire to promote consistency among the EIM entities, EIM tariff provisions. CAISO's tariff requires a certain amount of basic consistency among the EIM entities tariffs just in order to make the market function. But many of the other details within the EIM entities tariffs are left to their discretion and subject to their individual regulatory approvals, et cetera. I think it's easiest to think about this issue through the lens of a transmission customer, one that could be impacted by multiple different EIM entities tariffs, depending on the transactions that they're doing across different balancing areas. And they would be potentially impacted, the concern here would be they would be impacted with some inconsistencies between the tariffs that they're operating under. And, I talk about transmission customers here, but that could be an IPP transmission customer, like the company that I represent, or It could be an EIM entity, even with generation or load in another EIM entity's balancing area. Or the last example I could think of, at least, was a third-party load within a participating balancing area. So that's just meant to frame up the discussion. Again, it's a little bit new. Our discussions so far, I would say that from a theoretical perspective, at least, our internal discussions do tend to recognize the benefits of having consistent market rules across the footprint, simply from the perspective that it would tend to avoid confusion or decrease barriers to entry in the market and just promote market efficiency, broadly speaking. But several important, I would say more practical caveats or concerns to that broader market vision have also been a consistent part of our discussions to date. For example, and fundamentally, we've debated internally whether or not this is a governance issue at all, or if it's more of a question of market design and tariff implementation. We've talked about other countervailing principles such as flexibility also being really important for the market. Obviously, with such a diverse footprint within the EIM entities may have different and divergent tariff provisions for good reasons, for their own good reasons, unique to their balancing area. So, how do we determine when an inconsistency would rise to the level of concern for the market, or when they might be appropriate and warranted? And who would make that determination is another question. The suggestion to the GRC and the comments we received was for the governing body to play a role in reviewing individual tariffs for consistency issues specifically. But there have been questions have come up certainly about the expertise of the ISO staff and the governing body on issues specific to individual tariffs outside of the ISO's own footprint and tariff. And there's also fundamental questions, I think, about whether such a governing body review, in that example, anyways, will be consistent with the voluntary nature of the market. So with all those questions and important caveats, I do want to emphasize that at this stage, our discussions are more broadly considering the importance of consistency across tariffs, how it works today, if there are important gaps and other ways to promote or encourage consistency, or maybe to create some sort of process or functionality for raising important issues when and if they arise. So really kind of at a little bit of the brainstorming stage on this one still, and so you'll see, I think, that come out in our next turn. Lastly, I would say this topic has been viewed quite differently, and maybe with a little less concern under the EIM-only paradigm. So there could be a timing issue here as well with respect to, when, if we'll have more certainty around the potential EIM market design and the associated tariff implementation process for the EIM, which is definitely one point in the process where these types of issues will be hashed out. So that's the summary of where we are on this issue right now. Still lots of foundational discussions going on at this point, and I think it's fair to say we'll definitely appreciate additional stakeholder reactions and even ideas to how to approach this issue. So thank you, and with that, I think I hand it back to Therese and open it up for questions for Andy and I.
That's right. So #2, if you have a question or comment.
We do have one question in the queue currently, actually a couple.
Hi, this is Caitlin Leotiris. I wanted to speak up today on behalf of the American Wind Energy Association, or AWEA. AWEA was the commenter that brought up the last topic that Cameron reviewed on consistency across the market. I wanted to just start by thanking the GRC on behalf of OEA for considering this issue. I think it is of growing importance, especially as the market grows, not only in terms of the EIM's footprint and the jurisdictional nature of entities in the EIM, but also as it potentially expands to EIDAM. And I think this particular issue in OEA's perspective is important in the EIM, certainly, but to some extent the opportunity may have passed. We already have EIM tariffs implemented for most of the EIM entities. But there is really a unique opportunity here for EIDAM to implement a rule or implement what maybe you could refer to as a safety net of review of tariffs to make sure that they are reasonably consistent and really provide for an efficient and effective market for all participants. I want to maybe just emphasize something I heard Cameron say, that this is important not only at the kind of EIM entity level, but really for the transmission customers that have to transact across a variety of different tariffs. And I really wanted to perhaps call out the fact that I think this type of a role for the EIM governing body, or in the future an EIDAM governing body, really is consistent with the governing body's mission. And I just wanted to read a really brief section of the EIM governing body's charter that talks about its mission. And it says that the EIM governing body shall promote, protect, and expand the success of the EIM for the benefit of its participants as a whole. And then it goes on to say, including both participants transacting in the ISO and in the EIM. I think there's really a unique opportunity for the EIM or EIDAM governing body to really provide some additional benefits in ensuring that there is consistency across the market footprint as it grows. So again, just want to thank the EIM or the GRC for reviewing this issue and continuing to have discussions around it.
Thanks, Caitlin. Appreciate the comment. Others?
We do have other callers in the queue.
Good afternoon, Chair Hampton and Cameron. This is Clay MacArthur with Deseret Power. I also want to comment on the same issue that Caitlin raised on the EIDAM and EIM tariffs. I want to mention that this is not a trivial issue, and want to emphasize that it may be that only one entity commented on this in this process, but those of you who have participated in the Regional Issues Forum, the EIM Regional Issues Forum, are aware that this has been raised on numerous occasions in that forum, and there are a lot of entities who are concerned by this. Deseret Power, my organization, has operations in 4 separate balancing authorities, 3 of which will be EIM entities by the end of 2021. And we had identified these SEAMS issues as being a significant concern of ours as soon as the second EIM entity joined or began to join the market. And that was NV Energy. You may recall that NV Energy at the time was proposing timing deadlines for base schedules that was different than what Pacificor had implemented. And viewed in isolation, that would be an improvement because they were attempting to move deadlines for base schedules closer to the operating hour than what Pacificor had done. However, for entities who are transacting across that BA boundary, it created exposure for which and would ultimately create energy imbalance and costs for which there is no real identifiable benefit. That there's no reason that should create a cost. And so we had identified this as something early on, and those of you who have seen my presentations on the EIM, one of the things that this is exactly one of the items that we had highlighted, and I have a slide that says the only thing worse than 38 BAs in the WECC is 38 BAs in the WECC with their own implementation of the EIM and speaking their own EIM dialects. And so this is something that's been at the forefront of our concerns and the entities that we represent since the beginning of the EIM. I would also like to highlight that even entities with the same verbiage in their tariffs can have different implementations. And so it's not just tariff consistency, but also the implementation of the actual settlements with their counterparties that becomes a concern for us. And if you have, in addition to that, if you have one BA passing through some charge codes and another BA not passing through some charge codes or taking a different approach, you may be corrupting market signals, and that there is a best process here, a best practice here that needs to be adopted broadly. That's one of the promises of a regional market, is a homogeneous set of rules across that entire region. And if the GRC can take steps to maintain that consistency and maintain that homogeneity, the market will benefit from that. Whenever we have these differentials at the seams or these seams issues, we create friction in the market, and that friction results in costs. And at worst, those seams issues can incentivize undesirable behavior. And one example I gave in one of the regional issues forum was energy flows, which could exacerbate reliability. So we could incentivize energy flows in the opposite direction of what reliability constraints would desire. But at worst, they create opportunities for market exploitation. The other issue I'd like to highlight is market seems become a significant barrier for market monitoring. That's one of the functions of the California ISO's Department of Market Monitoring, is to have oversight over the implementation of the energy imbalance market. But if you have 38 different dialects, it's incredibly difficult for the Department of Market Monitoring to maintain, to perform their responsibilities in all BAs. And so what you end up with is a lack of market monitoring, which is a concern of ours. And so inconsistent tariffs create a blind spot for the market monitor. So we do support and do ask that this issue be continued to be reviewed and to look for opportunities to consolidate these tariffs. Our ideal outcome would be that all EIM entities incorporate by reference common language into their tariffs. They do the same thing for other aspects of the tariff to implement the EIM, and we would ask that be expanded. In lieu of that, anything that can be done to eliminate these seams issues, we would support. And so I appreciate the opportunity to comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Clay. Appreciate the comments. Are there other comments?
We've got one more.
Other callers on? Okay, great. Go ahead.
So this is Anita Decker, and I'm on the governing body. And I really do want to applaud the work of the entire GRC committee. You guys have just done an amazing job, and there is so much support for the work you're doing. I do have one question, and it's for Andy. And my question is, why wouldn't an OME be jointly commissioned by the Board of Governors and the governing body, since understanding the markets and the market design is going to be needed by both boards to be understood and to consider, and that would also then engage a pretty robust stakeholder process if there was that joint commission. So just interested in why that hasn't been looked at in that way.
Yeah, thanks, Member Decker. That's I think that hasn't been looked at, because I don't recall that being put forward as a specific recommendation. I think it's definitely something we should look at. I think maybe a couple of initial comments. An OME, as we are considering it, would be the work outputs of an OME would be available to the Board of Governors and even stakeholders more broadly. And I think maybe underlying the direction we were going was an assumption that the existing resources, including ISO staff, the DMM, and the MSC, would kind of address, would help the Board of Governors work through sort of EIDAM market design deliberations. But that's an interesting idea. I appreciate that you've raised that, so we can talk about that more.
Yeah, I would appreciate consideration of that, because it seems to me that we've got a very robust stakeholder effort certainly with the EIM board, and that having that stakeholder process engaged in scoping, and then both boards agreeing of the scope. And I'm not suggesting that it replace DMM or MSC. In terms of a separate effort, which is what I've seen the OME to be, that might be at least looked at as a consideration. So thank you, Andy.
Thanks.
With that, there are no further questions.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. Thank you for the input. Thank you for the questions, really helpful. Actually, thank you for letting us do this, which we've not quite done before, where we kind of share the issues and the conversations and the factors that are at play in each of these issues. Let's talk about what the next steps are. So like I said, we are in working groups. We are coming back to the full GRC to kind of look at all of these issues in their entirety. So, you know, we both look at them individually, but we look at the entire straw proposal in its entirety. We are targeting mid-December for publication of a revised straw proposal. We recognize, I've been on the receiving end of this, we do not want to deliver to you a revised straw proposal on December 20th and ask for comments back in early January, so we're kind of mindful of that. And so we'll take the whole comment process into consideration when we make the decision about mid-December. If for some reason it feels like it's going to be tight, we might move to early January, so just know we're kind of somewhere in that space. We still are looking to get a draft final proposal by Q1 of 2021, which, you know, if you look at these timelines, they feel a little tight, but I think mid-December is our target for the revised straw proposal for all of you, and then still targeting Q1 of 2021 for the draft final proposal. With that, that's the end of our meeting here today. I do want to say for anybody that might be watching this on a recording, if you have a question or a comment, you can submit that into the CAISO emails, which you can find at the top of or the bottom of any one of the websites, and we appreciate you engaging in this topic and look forward to talking with you once we've finished the revised straw proposal. Thanks so much.